So welcome to our fifth module where we're going to be looking at science and technological advances. And in this first unit, we're going to look at the use and influence of science, which is one of the two substrands of the science as a human endeavour in the Australian curriculum. So it's quite an important substrand in that it's really important for our students to understand that science can be used in different ways and it has impacts on some of the broader contexts of science. And we're going to look at some of those today, including things like population, sustainable cities, energy, healthy communities, and security. So we'll look at some of the uses and influences of science within our society itself. So let's have a look at population. You're probably thinking, well, what's the big deal between population and science? So let's have a look at this first hyperlink, which will give you some understanding of the implications of our increasing population.
1,000 years ago, there were only 1/3 of a billion people, but we were multiplying. Now there's 7 billion of us. How did we grow so much so fast? Say this glass is North America. The fuller the glass gets, the more people there are. Water drips in as people are born. Water drips out as people die. Okay, here's the entire world. Now let's go back 1,000 years. The Americas are nearly empty. Europe and Africa have less than 100 million people between them. And just like today, most people live in China, India, and the rest of Asia. For centuries, things stay pretty much the same. Births are canceled out by deaths. Women are having lots of babies, but most babies die before they grow up and have families of their own. We don't reach 1 billion until 1804. But things are changing. Better medicine and better agriculture are starting to slow the leak from the bottom of the glass. People still die, of course, but more babies grow up and have babies of their own. Lots of babies. We've grown from 1 billion to 7 billion, and it only took 200 years. Will we keep going like this? Probably not. The UN says we'll level out at 10 billion by the end of the century. So as we continue to grow from 7 billion, the question is, can the world hold that many people? Experts can't agree. It all depends on how well we manage our food, water, and energy.
Okay, so it's a really interesting ICT, and you may not have been aware of that exponential rise we have had in our world population, and for those reasons. So they're the applications of science that I'm sort of hinting at, is that because we have better agricultural techniques, we have better medicines, we have actually disrupted that natural population growth. So we've altered it with our applications of science. So we know now that the global population will swell from over 7 billion today to more than 9 billion in the next 40 years. And so we've got, as a result of that and the increased number of people we have rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And we know that today that's one of the most talked about results of human activity, and it's likely to stay a hot topic for the foreseeable future. And importantly, and the clip highlighted this, we've got the developing countries such as China and India. They're becoming wealthier, and their consumption and thus their environmental footprint is growing as well. And we also do know that some of the practices in some of these Asian countries, they're not as environmentally aware. They don't have the same kind of policies as many of the Western countries do. So there are lots of concerns about the environmental footprint for countries such as India and China. We know water is going to pose a problem in the future, and that's not just in developing nations. It's really touted as the number one concern, even over sort of the whole idea of global warming. So Australian cities are planning for increased populations by building desalination plants, and others are looking at recycling sewage to save precious water. And you may remember when we had our drought back in the mid to sort of 2000s, the idea that we were looking at recycling water, and we had a huge debate about whether the community would accept that, and ultimately they said they wouldn't. But there's lots of issues associated with that, and also desalination plants as well. They use tremendous amounts of energy to actually make them operational. So many of them that have been built are actually not being operated at this time. So not surprisingly, as we've done in every course, in this particular set of modules, there's another side to the debate. So let's have a quick look at that.
The myth of overpopulation originated in England in 1798, when a vicar named Thomas Malthus, who fancied himself something of a mathematician, saw that food production increased incrementally, but people reproduced exponentially. He sat down and did some simple math, and summarily decided that the world would be out of food by 1890. He blamed reduced mortality rates, and recommended killing off the have-nots of society, lest the haves starve to death. This cry was taken up by Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University in 1968, who claimed that reckless human reproduction had overwhelmed the Earth. Massive famines would result, which would destroy, best case scenario, 1/5 of humanity by the end of the 70s, and the planet would follow. This fear produced large donations for the newly created UNFPA, which thrives on an imagined crisis that has been both imminent and rescheduled again and again over the past 2 centuries. The truth of the matter is that every family on this planet could have a house with a yard and all live together on a landmass the size of Texas, which is really just a small corner of the planet. The population of Earth will peak in 30 years and then start to go back down. We're not overpopulated. Do the math.
So a lot of the ideas with that one stem around the fact of it's not so much that we don't have enough, it's that we actually don't distribute what we do have in a way that allows the populations in different countries to have the same access to resources. So it's a really interesting area to look at. So population is one of our first applications of science. Let's have a look at another one, sustainable cities. And we know cities are slow to change. And because of these new challenges we're facing, such as climate change, water shortage, energy concerns, new technologies, and like we said in the last slide, a growing population, we're having unprecedented pressure on today's planners, architects, and engineers to build cities that will be able to cope with the conditions in the future. So we have an increased focus on public transport and building more dense and compact communities. So these are all related issues. So it comes down to transport as well. The importance of environmental sustainability will ensure that future residential buildings will be much more environmentally friendly. Unfortunately, though, we do have a crisis of skilled professionals in these areas and as such a demand for them. So anything that needs to be sustainable needs to have the planners there that can do the work to put these things into place. And anyone that's been to the Nathan campus will have seen, the lovely 6-star environmentally friendly building there, where the red zone is, and like a lot of science went into basically designing that so that it could be environmentally sustainable. It has very low demands with water and energy, and they're the sorts of things that we need to think about for future planning. Also, obviously, energy, ultimately. Concerns about climate change and a lack of cheap oil. One challenge for the future is to develop and implement clean, reliable sources of energy. We know we've already got lots of ideas and lots of technologies there for alternatives to petroleum. We have oil derived from shale is becoming more attractive, and biofuels, which are made from plants, have received a lot of attention in recent years. In terms of our electricity supply, the future will see Australia using a more varied mix of sources. Coal still will be used because that is our dominant source of energy here in Australia. But capturing and storing the climate-changing carbon dioxide that is produced will be a focus of ongoing research. Basically, what are we going to do with that carbon dioxide that we are producing in excess numbers? Natural gas and possibly nuclear power will also be utilised. So Australia has a large store of nuclear ore that can be used for nuclear power, but at the moment we predominantly export that to other countries. We don't have a nuclear power source here in Australia. Alternative sources such as solar, wind and geothermal will be utilised, but we require more research to determine if they're as viable. And the main concern with these ones is the low energy output we get for the dollars that it costs to produce them. So actually implementing alternative sources is quite expensive. and the actual load that we produce from them is quite small compared to what we can get from coal. So, there's a lot of more work to be done there to make these more viable for businesses to think about. Healthy communities. So this is really important. So to successfully control and combat disease, new discoveries will need to be made in the future. You might remember some of these particular flus, the SARS virus, that was a virus, not a flu, bird flu, swine flu, throughout those sort of early 2000s. And you might have also heard of some of these new, what we call zoonoses, which are basically new strains of disease that develop from existing animal diseases. So Ebola, rabies, thalassivirus, hendra. So this one here is quite topical for us here in Queensland. Diseases that are spread from animals to humans. And the hendra is one that goes from horses to humans. So there's lots of concerns about what's happening there with those new strains of disease that we actually don't have the technology for. So obviously things like those types of diseases, swine flu, bird flu, they're the ones that grab the headlines. But some of our biggest threats are far less sensational. So things like, and we touched on this in our last module, the combination of increased longevity, in other words, people are living longer, and poor diet has led to an alarming increase in the incidence of chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancers, and other neurodegenerative diseases. So to understand the cures and causes for these diseases, we're going to need top graduates in our science, our STEM-related fields, to continue the work. So again, as far as the use and influence of science goes, these are ongoing problems, and we're going to continue to need highly qualified scientists to work on these issues. And the final one is security. And there's all different types of security, whether we're talking about internet security, border security, or security on our streets. It's a continuing challenge, and particularly with the number of terrorist threats we've had in recent years, security is a big issue. If we're looking at the internet, we need properly trained computer professionals. Again, they're in high demand because we have an increased usage of the internet in our daily lives, and we know that cybercrime is becoming increasingly common, and it's getting harder and harder to fix. Physical boundaries are at risk too, so we do know that back in our grandparents' era, no one ever went overseas, and we know most people we speak to now will have been overseas at least once, because the cost of flying is so much lower compared to what it was 50 years ago. So we have a lot more travel between countries. So this is great for tourism, but it is a concern for our agriculture and our biodiversity. So Australia is what we call an island nation. Okay, we're quite segregated from the rest of the world, so we've been quite privileged to be free of many pests and diseases such as rabies. So we've got to ensure that our quarantine laws are kept strict to ensure that we do not allow many of these problems into our country. So your activity, it's quite simple. There's no readings to do with this one, but how aware were you of these important science-related issues? But more importantly, what is your responsibility as a classroom teaching in ensuring your students are aware of these issues? Okay, so these are some of the applications of science that we can use to really engage our students in, why do we learn science? Or because we can learn about our future lives and maybe even our future professions. So share your views on the discussion board on that one, and we're going to look at some of the advances in science and technology next.